Imagine a world where nations prepare for war because of shadows and documents. The fear of invisible weapons can feel urgent and absolute when leaders speak with conviction and certainty. That certainty became the spark for a war that would change the Middle East forever. Years later, historians still ask how certainty overcame skepticism and caution in that moment. The search for weapons of mass destruction became both rationale and obsession for decision-makers who believed disaster was imminent. The story of those beliefs and their consequences begins long before the first tanks crossed the border. The intelligence that led to war was not a single document, but an accumulation of fragments and interpretations. Analysts pieced together satellite images, signals intercepts, defectors' tales, and incomplete laboratory reports into a narrative that fit worst-case scenarios. That narrative gained momentum because it gave leaders a clear and frightening explanation for regional instability. Assumptions began to harden into facts as policymakers sought decisive answers with political urgency and limited patience. The logic that linked Saddam Hussein to weapons of mass destruction fit into a familiar script about rogue regimes threatening global order. That script, amplified by media and politicians, drowned out rival interpretations and cautionary voices. Decision-making in 2002 and 2003 happened at the intersection of fear, politics, and imperfect information. The Bush administration framed Iraq as an immediate threat and a link in the broader war on terror, shaping public opinion and parliamentary debates. Once that frame took hold, alternatives such as containment or inspections were increasingly portrayed as inadequate or risky. Political incentives pushed leaders toward action, rather than continued diplomacy, because clear demonstrations of strength often carry domestic and international political rewards. The momentum toward invasion accelerated after public addresses and UN debates, where urgency was rhetorically prioritized over uncertainty. In that atmosphere, the burden of proof shifted away from those advocating war and onto those demanding proof of imminent threat. The formal legal and diplomatic steps toward invasion were rapid and contentious in equal measure. The United States sought authorization through arguments presented to allies and to the United Nations, while building coalitions of willing partners for a possible military campaign. Those diplomatic efforts were often strained by conflicting analyses and differing national risk assessments among allies. Votes and resolutions became battlegrounds, where intelligence claims were debated as much as they were accepted or rejected. Public statements from intelligence agencies were simplified for political consumption, producing a blurred line between technical uncertainty and public certainty. As a result, the legal case for war rested on a mixture of contested intelligence and strategic assumptions. One of the central claims used to justify invasion was that Iraq possessed active programs for weapons of mass destruction. That claim combined allegations about chemical, biological, and nuclear programs into a single acute threat. For many observers around the world, this claim translated into an image of imminent catastrophe unless immediate action was taken. This conviction was reinforced by selected intelligence pieces that seemed to indicate resumed activity in prohibited programs. The public spectacle of those claims made nuance difficult, and nuance often requires time that political timelines did not allow. In the end, the public case for war was constructed as a moral imperative against imagined weapons that could be deployed without notice. The search for weapons after the invasion became a physical and symbolic quest that occupied occupying forces and international inspectors. Teams of military specialists, CIA units, and uninspectors moved through Iraqi facilities and cities with lists of suspected sites and materials. Each empty bunker and each failed assay became part of a mounting contradiction between expectation and reality. Those searches were not purely scientific or procedural, because they carried enormous political consequences for occupying powers and for Iraqi citizens. The weight of expectation made failure seem like negligence, and every negative finding demanded further explanation. The work of finding something that may not exist changed the character of occupation and investigation on the ground. Why were the weapons not found? One simple explanation is that they did not exist in the forms imagined by Western intelligence. Decades earlier, international inspections and sanctions had dismantled large parts of Iraqi programs, and sanctions and covert actions had eroded infrastructure capacities. Multiple inspectors had documented destruction and degradation long before 2003, even as later narratives suggested hidden programs remained active. Additionally, Iraq had strategic incentives to mask or misrepresent remaining capabilities to deter regional adversaries and to maintain bargaining power. The distinction between capability and intent became central, but often invisible to outside observers who wanted concrete evidence. In short, absence of evidence often reflected prior dismantling, deception, or low-level remnants, rather than an active modern WMD industry. Intelligence failures were not simply technical mistakes. They were organizational phenomena with cognitive and institutional roots. Analysts operated under pressures to produce decisive answers in a politicized environment where equivocal findings were unwelcome, confirmation bias, groupthink, and the echo chamber of shared assumptions distorted the way ambiguous signals were interpreted and elevated speculative reports. Organizational cultures rewarded clarity over ambiguity, producing analytic shortcuts that disguised uncertainty as confidence. These institutional dynamics interacted with political incentives that preferred decisive action to prolonged debate. As a result, intelligence products often presented a warmer level of certainty than the underlying data could justify. Defectors and human sources contributed to a narrative that suggested hidden weapons when evidence was thin or contradictory. Some defectors provided useful leads, while others offered fabricated or exaggerated claims motivated by personal gain or political agendas. Intelligence services sometimes relied upon these testimonies while understating their doubts or the context for those claims. The challenge of verifying human intelligence in a closed authoritarian environment made corroboration difficult and expensive when human sources pointed toward a frightening conclusion. Bureaucratic mechanisms often validated rather than discounted those claims. This tendency turned isolated stories into pieces of a broader mosaic that appeared coherent to those predisposed to believe it. Satellite imagery and technical collection were both decisive and misleading in equal measure during the pre-war years. Imagery analysts saw patterns of activity and installations that resembled weapons, related infrastructure, but interpreting function from form has inherent uncertainties. Agricultural or industrial structures were sometimes misread as laboratories or storage facilities when viewed without contextual grounding on the ground. Signals intelligence and intercepts likewise provided tantalizing fragments that fit the desired narrative without fully substantiating it. Small anomalies were amplified into signs of a program working around inspections and surveillance. The combination of technical data and interpretive eagerness created a picture that looked complete until investigators put boots on the ground and discovered otherwise. Public rhetoric about imminent threats compressed complex uncertainty into digestible slogans and warnings that had emotional power. Political leaders used stark language to persuade domestic publics and international partners that action was unavoidable. Once that language took hold, dismantling the narrative required rare and forceful evidence to counter the established belief. The role of media in amplifying certain claims without sufficient skepticism contributed to a climate where fear outpaced verification. News cycles favored dramatic assertions over careful technical caveats, giving simplified stories oversized influence. The result was a public consensus shaped more by conviction and spectacle than by painstaking intelligence, nuance. When the invasion began, the expectations on the ground were stark and immediate, and military forces searched hundreds of sites rapidly and often chaotically. Coalition troops moved through cities and facilities expecting to uncover forbidden stockpiles and hidden labs. Instead, they found empty bunkers, stripped warehouses, and abandoned industrial equipment more consistent with dismantling and decay than active programs. The mismatch between expectation and reality created confusion and second-order consequences, including accusations of incompetence and intentional concealment. The need to produce results sometimes led to rushed conclusions and questionable evidence-gathering practices. For many troops and investigators, the dissonance was both professionally and emotionally disorienting. The consequences of failing to find WMDs rippled far beyond intelligence circles and into global geopolitics in ways that many did not anticipate. Credibility suffered for governments that had presented certainty to the public, causing domestic political fallout and international skepticism. The absence of expected weapons undermined arguments that had justified a major use of force, generating long-term diplomatic costs. This loss of credibility had practical consequences for future interventions and alliances, because trust among partners depends on shared understanding of facts and motives. Allies who had been persuaded to participate faced domestic backlash and strategic recalibration. The reputational damage also emboldened adversaries and complicated cooperation on other security issues around the world. Beyond geopolitics, the human cost of the invasion and occupation was immediate and profound for Iraqi civilians and for deployed soldiers. Civilians experienced displacement, loss of infrastructure, and the breakdown of public services that sustained daily life. The violence and instability that followed fractured communities and deepened sectarian divides that had been suppressed under authoritarian control. For soldiers and veterans, the psychological toll and the moral weight of ambiguous missions left lasting scars long after deployments ended. Families of the fallen and wounded carried grief, while many service members grappled with questions about the purpose and morality of their missions. The human ledger of the war continued to mount even as the justification for conflict remained disputed. The occupation period revealed structural problems in planning and governance that exacerbated instability and fueled insurgency. Dismantling state institutions without clear plans for replacement created power vacuums that armed groups quickly exploited. The sudden collapse of public order and employment opportunities turned frustrations into organized resistance that used violence and asymmetrical tactics. Initial security and governance strategies prioritized speed and symbolic victories over sustainable institution building and local legitimacy. Insurgencies thrived in the gaps left by broken institutions and fragmented authority. These dynamics made stabilization much harder even as international forces attempted to search for the wartime threats they had proclaimed. Sectarian dynamics, long suppressed by Saddam Hussein's regime, resurfaced rapidly and violently under conditions of uncertainty and competition. Political exclusion, historical grievances, and foreign meddling combined to turn political contests into deadly confrontations. The violence that followed was not simply a continuation of old feuds, but an intensification fueled by new weapons, proxies, and regional rivalries. Regional powers and non-state actors found profit in supporting factions inside Iraq, turning the country into a theater for broader contests. The resulting fragmentation made coherent national governance far more difficult and prolonged the security dilemma for ordinary citizens. The human cost multiplied as communities were forced into defensive and often brutal responses. The absence of WMDs became a focal point for accountability debates and for reevaluating how intelligence is produced. And used investigations and inquiries examined how assessments were made, who made them, and how they were presented to leaders and publics. These reports highlighted procedural flaws, cognitive biases, and the politicization of technical judgments in high-stakes contexts. Recommendations from such investigations emphasized the need for clearer communication of uncertainty and for institutional mechanisms that preserve analytic independence. They also called for bolstering open, source, and multinational verification capabilities. Yet implementing reforms proved politically difficult in environments that often reward certainty over caution. The Iraq War altered the calculus of intervention for 2 decades after 2003 in ways that are still unfolding today. Policymakers became more wary of claims about imminent threats without robust verification and broader international support. Conversely, the war also created precedents for unilateral action and for military solutions when diplomacy appeared slow or ineffective. The legacy of Iraq informed debates about Syria, Libya, and other crises, where questions of evidence, humanitarian urgency, and national interest intersected. Each subsequent crisis drew on memories of 2003, sometimes as cautionary tales and sometimes as arguments for different kinds of intervention. The war reshaped not only a country, but also global norms about when and how to use force. The legal and moral questions surrounding the invasion have been debated by scholars, activists, and courts around the world. Was the invasion lawful under international law and the UN Charter given the ambiguous intelligence? Did political leaders act in good faith or recklessly with consequences they could not fully foresee? These debates cut to the heart of how democracies should make decisions about war and peace. Public memory and legal accountability are rarely perfectly aligned because political realities often complicate efforts to adjudicate past decisions. Some officials faced public criticism and inquiry, but few were held criminally accountable in a way that satisfied critics. The unresolved nature of these debates continues to shape public trust in institutions and the ethics of intervention. On the ground in Iraq, the physical reconstruction and political reconciliation proved far harder than initial planners estimated. Restoring electricity, water, and healthcare required resources and security that were not readily available amid insurgency and corruption. The mismatch between short-term military aims and long-term civil needs produced chronic failures in rebuilding trust and institutions. Economic dislocation and unemployment further undermined stability and pushed many citizens into informal economies or to join armed groups. Reconstruction funds were slow, mismanaged, or captured by cronies and profiteers, eroding local confidence in the occupation and its purported aims. The day-to-day realities for ordinary Iraqis became a study in how conflict perpetuates deprivation and dislocation. The war also catalyzed the rise of new violent actors that exploited the chaos and ideological currents in the region. Extremist organizations found fertile ground in the disorder, recruiting disaffected youth and seizing territory where governance failed entirely. The rise of such groups added another layer of tragedy and complexity to a conflict that began with contested intelligence claims. Global counterterrorism efforts adapted to this new reality, often emphasizing kinetic operations and partnerships with local forces. Yet those tactics sometimes repeated earlier mistakes by prioritizing short-term military objectives over durable political solutions. The emergence of powerful non-state actors reconfigured regional security in ways that outlived occupying forces. For many Iraqis, the war meant prolonged insecurity, trauma, and a generation interrupted by violence and displacement. Children who grew up during the occupation often lacked consistent schooling, healthcare, and the sense of safety necessary for development. These human costs are not easily captured in statistics, but they represent a long-term erosion of social capital and hope. Diaspora communities carried memories and grievances abroad while families at home struggled with loss and adaptation. Rebuilding social trust in such fractured contexts is a generational task that requires more than economic investment. The human stories from Iraq demonstrate how geopolitical decisions translate into lifelong consequences for ordinary people. The intelligence community itself underwent reforms and introspection in response to the failures exposed by the Iraq episode. New protocols emphasized clearer differentiation between assessed judgments and raw intelligence, and analytic methods sought to make uncertainty explicit. Some agencies created red teams and adverse analysis units designed to challenge prevailing assumptions and reduce groupthink. Despite reforms, the underlying human tendencies toward confirmation bias and politicization remain persistent risks whenever intelligence intersects with policy. Institutional reforms can mitigate but not eliminate these risks, because organizations are composed of people who operate under incentives and narratives. The lessons of Iraq therefore remain relevant as warnings rather than guarantees. Memories of 2003 create a political and cultural afterimage that affects public trust in government and media institutions. For some citizens, the war represents a catastrophic misjudgment that demanded accountability and humility from leaders. For others, it remains a contested chapter of necessary action with complex outcomes that defy simple moral verdicts. This polarized memory complicates how societies learn from past mistakes, because collective narratives are often partial and reinforced by selective evidence. Honest reckoning requires acknowledging both the failures and the genuine fears that motivated policy choices. Only through such nuanced reflection can institutions hope to reduce the risk of repeating comparable mistakes. The Iraqi state itself underwent profound transformation, sometimes in painful and unintended ways as a result of invasion and occupation. The collapse and subsequent rebuilding of state structures opened opportunities for new elites, while also marginalizing others and exacerbating sectarian quotas. The new political architecture often reflected the influence of external powers rather than organic national consensus. These institutional changes influenced policy outcomes and local governance in ways that complicated reconciliation and national identity. Power became fragmented among parties and militias with differing loyalties and external backers. Reconstituting a coherent national project remains a core challenge for Iraqi society in the post-war decades. International law scholars and practitioners took lessons from the pre-war intelligence debates about the threshold for military intervention, the norms around preventive action, humanitarian intervention, and regime change were all scrutinized in the aftermath. Legal scholars debated whether the Iraq War recalibrated expectations about the legitimacy of unilateral or coalition. Base force, those debates continue to influence how states think about intervention in the face of emerging threats such as cyber attacks, pandemics, or novel weapons. The need for robust verification, transparent legal rationale, and multilateral consensus remains a dominant theme in post-Iraq normative discussions. The war hence serves as an example of the legal and ethical stakes involved when uncertainty meets power. The role of media coverage during the pre-war and invasion periods shaped public perception and political accountability in meaningful ways. Visual images and compelling narratives made abstract intelligence claims immediate for mass audiences. At the same time, the hunger for tidy stories led many outlets to underreport uncertainty and overreport sensational claims that fit prevailing frames. Later reflections within journalism questioned earlier coverage and called for higher standards of skepticism and verification. New journalistic practices emphasized deeper investigative work and multi-source corroboration, especially for claims that might justify war. Yet, the commercial pressures of modern media still create incentives that can reward expediency over exhaustive truth seeking. The geopolitical map of the Middle East was altered not only by military action but also by the war's second-order effects on alliances and rivalries. Iran, for instance, emerged stronger regionally by filling power vacuums and cultivating local allies across Iraq. The shifting balance of influence prompted new calculations by regional powers and external actors for years to come. These changes fed into proxy conflicts and strategic contests that extended well beyond Iraq's borders. The diffusion of power and the proliferation of armed non-state actors complicated traditional diplomacy and security arrangements. The result was a more fragmented and volatile regional environment that remains challenging to manage. Economically, the war and its aftermath disrupted energy markets, reconstruction spending, and global investment patterns in unpredictable ways. Short-term spikes in oil prices reflected fears about supply, while long-term investment hesitancy affected reconstruction and development. Corruption, poor contracting, and insecurity siphoned off resources intended for rebuilding critical infrastructure and services. The interplay between strategic interests, resource wealth, and governance capacity produced outcomes that often benefited narrow interests rather than broad public welfare. This economic dynamic deepened inequality and undermined opportunities for sustainable recovery. For citizens, economic dislocation became another form of long-term consequence from decisions made amid uncertain intelligence. In theaters of politics and popular culture, the memory of the Iraq War inspired films, books, and debates that continue to shape public understanding. Artists and journalists attempted to render the complexities of the conflict in human terms rather than purely strategic language. These cultural artifacts have been important in preserving individual testimonies and in fostering collective reflection about truth and responsibility. By telling personal stories and examining institutional failures, such works challenge simplified narratives and encourage a more empathetic and complex public conversation. They remind audiences that geopolitical decisions ripple through private lives in ways that statistics cannot fully convey. In doing so, cultural memory plays an essential role in democratic accountability and historical learning. The scholarship on pre-war intelligence and the war's aftermath offers lessons about how democracies confront uncertainty and threat. Scholars emphasize institutional design changes, better incentives for dissenting views, and the cultural importance of humility in forecasting. These academic debates are not abstract exercises, but practical recommendations aimed at reducing the chance of catastrophic misjudgments in future crises. Implementing such lessons requires political will and public demand for accountability, both of which are uneven and often short-lived, yet the intellectual work that emerged after 2003 continues to inform training, doctrine, and policy in intelligence and foreign affairs. This ongoing conversation is one of the durable legacies of the Iraq episode for those who study how nations decide to go to war. There is a philosophical core to the story of the Iraq War that goes beyond mechanics of intelligence and politics. It questions how societies balance fear against evidence and how narratives of threat can become self-fulfilling prophecies when acted upon precipitously. The ethical dilemma remains: is it better to risk inaction against an uncertain threat or to risk action based on uncertain intelligence? This dilemma has no simple answer, but the Iraq experience highlights the costs when the balance tips toward hasty intervention. It also underlines the moral obligation to accompany force with rigorous accountability and with plans for long-term recovery and reconciliation. Those lessons remain relevant as new technologies and new threats change the contours of existential risk. Looking back, the claim of hidden weapons acted as both cause and cover for deeper geopolitical ambitions and miscalculations. Some leaders genuinely believed in the intelligence, while others may have found it convenient to fit broader strategic goals. The ambiguity of motives complicates simplistic narratives about blame and intention, requiring careful historical and ethical examination. Understanding this complexity does not excuse failures or negate suffering, but it does demand disciplined analysis that resists caricature. Only by grappling with messy motives and uncertain facts can societies craft better institutions and norms to prevent similar tragedies in the future. This kind of honest engagement is essential for democratic maturity. As we consider contemporary security dilemmas, the lessons from Iraq are painfully relevant for issues like proliferation, cyber warfare, and biological threats. Each of these domains involves high uncertainty, rapid technological change, and potentially catastrophic results if misjudged. The tendency to seek decisive action in the face of fear remains a perennial temptation with profound moral stakes. Therefore, institutional checks, transparent processes, and a vigilant public sphere remain our best defenses against repeating earlier mistakes. Strengthening international verification regimes and cooperative intelligence sharing can help distribute risk and reduce unilateral error. The story of Iraq thus serves as a cautionary tale and a call to better collective governance. In the end, the most enduring images from that period are not of missing weapons, but of consequences that are vividly present. Rubble, refugees, memorials, and fractured communities testify to the human price of decisions made under uncertainty. The moral calculus of those decisions remains contested, but the human evidence of loss is unambiguous and compelling. This contradiction between absent weapons and abundant suffering forces a reconsideration of how societies wield power and speak truth. It asks citizens and leaders alike to prioritize rigorous verification, restraint, and preparedness for long-term responsibilities. Those implications are essential to any honest evaluation of the Iraq episode and of similar crises to come. The legacy of the Iraq War continues to shape the lived realities of millions of people and the strategic calculations of nations. Decades of violence, displacement, and political upheaval can trace part of their lineage to decisions made in the name of preventing catastrophic weapons. Remembering this link is not an argument for fatalism, but a demand for better judgment and institutional humility. Every new generation that studies this history faces the task of translating lessons into practice, and that translation requires vigilance and civic engagement. If policymakers are to avoid repeating comparable mistakes, publics must insist on transparency, accountability, and careful deliberation. The future depends on learning honestly from the past. There is a philosophical twist in understanding absence as a form of evidence in itself, demanding humility and skepticism from powerful actors. The non-existence of expected threats should prompt careful reassessment and public accountability rather than rhetorical triumphalism. Learning the right lessons from absence requires institutional curiosity, and moral courage to admit error and to repair harm where possible. This approach reframes failure as an opportunity for systemic improvement rather than as a political football to be exploited. It is the kind of mature civic response societies must cultivate if they are to avoid the repetition of catastrophic mistakes. In that sense, absence becomes an imperative for deeper truth-seeking and responsible governance. If this history feels distant, remember that the logic which produced it lives on in new debates about threats and interventions. The same urge to act decisively meets new technologies and new domains where the cost of error may be even higher. Therefore, the civic task of demanding rigorous standards of proof and humane post-conflict planning is more important than ever. We owe the victims of that conflict a careful accounting and a commitment to do better as communities and as nations. The shadows that justified war in 2003 are a warning, and their consequences are an obligation to future generations. That moral responsibility is part of the living legacy of Iraq. History does not absolve or condemn easily. It asks for rigorous inquiry, moral honesty, and civic engagement from each generation. The story of the weapons that were not there is a study of human fallibility, institutional dynamics, and geopolitical ambition entangled with real human suffering. Learning from it means changing institutions, improving verification, and cultivating public deliberation that resist simple answers. If this essay has given you a new perspective on how uncertainty can produce catastrophe, then the final responsibility falls to you as a citizen and a viewer. Ask questions of leaders, demand transparency, and insist on policies grounded in verified evidence rather than fearful assumption. Only through active engagement can the lessons of Iraq lead to wiser decisions in the future.